Everyone. Thank you and hello. Thank you for so much. Thank you for being here today. My name is Jillian Cobb and I am the public programs producer here at the National Nordic Museum. You are tuning in today to our Meet the Author series, which features books newly published by Nordic and Nordic American authors, as well as those that examine Nordic art, culture, and history. On-site and online Meet the Author programs introduce an author through a conversation moderated by subject matter experts and literary translators and offer an opportunity for you to get your questions answered. We are delighted today to welcome Nicklas Brendborg, author of Jellyfish Age Backwards, Nature's Secrets to Longevity. Our moderator for today is Dr. Elizabeth DeNoma, founder of DeNoma Literary Services and an international publishing consulting business offering translation, editorial, and foreign rights services. She holds a PhD in Scandinavian languages and literature from the University of Washington and has worked in both the technology and publishing industries for companies such as Microsoft, Amazon, Sebes and Bisling, and the Ross Yoon Agency. She is the translator of books such as The Darkness Manifesto and today's title, Jellyfish Age Backwards. So since Elizabeth is the translator for Jellyfish Age Backwards, I can think of no one better suited to introduce Nicklas and to get us started today on our riveting conversation of this book. So Elizabeth, I will go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you for the introduction too. And I welcome everyone. It's so wonderful to have so many people here today. And hello, Nicklas. Before I introduce Nicklas, I'm going to add a sort of a logistical note, because when we have groups this big and subject matter like this, people tend to have a lot of questions. So please put your questions in the chat. As soon as you think of them, if you like, even right now, if you already know there's a subject you want to talk about, put your question in the chat and I'll integrate it as we go along if it's part of the subject matter that we're discussing. Otherwise, we'll take them at the end. We'll save a decent chunk of time for questions at the end, but I'll say in advance, if I don't get to your question, I apologize. And with that said, welcome, Nicklas. Nicklas Brendborg is a PhD student of molecular biology at the University of Copenhagen and one of the most promising research talents in the field. He was the featured scientist at the Novo Nordisk International Talent Program and was awarded the Nobel Scholarship. The book we're discussing today, Jellyfish Age Backwards, was a near instant bestseller in its native Denmark and is sold into 26 languages at last count. The book was featured on several end-of-the-year best lists for science writing and has gotten great acclaim for the way that the author is able to relay complicated information in a simple and entertaining way. This book was an absolute delight to translate, and I'm so excited to talk about it with you today, Nicklas. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And where are you today? Are you in Copenhagen or?
I am in my apartment in Copenhagen, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So the book was just published in the US on the 17th of January, right? So we're right on the cusp here, we're on the cutting edge.
Absolutely. So, you know, it's been a long way on the way in different countries around the world. So it was actually out in English, but the American version just launched, and of course that's a big one that I've always been dreaming about when I wrote the book in the beginning. The biggest book market in the world, so it's really exciting to see how many people it's already reached, and of course I'll do anything I can to see how many people I can spread the word to.
Wonderful. Well, would you tell us a little bit how you were drawn into anti-aging research and then into writing about it?
Yeah, so actually Jellyfish Age Backwards is going to be the first book in a trilogy of these science and lifestyle books that I'm writing. And I think the interesting thing about aging research, which is this theme of this book, is that right now, as a biomedical scientist, I see how we spend a lot of effort, of course, in trying to treat cancer and heart disease and dementia and all these different age-related diseases that take the life of most people in modern countries today. But the interesting aspect about aging research is that it says that while all these diseases have a different cause that is, of course, completely unique to each different disease and even to subtypes of the different diseases, there is one overarching theme affecting them all, and that is aging. So someone like me who's 27, I don't get dementia, have a very low risk of getting some kind of heart attack, and I'm also protected against most kinds of cancer. But the older I get, the higher my risk becomes from all these for all these diseases. So the main idea in aging research is simply that if we could slow down the aging process, then we could decrease the risk of all these different diseases at once. So yeah, I just found that incredibly exciting, and I think it's definitely the future in medicine, and in where I wanted to go with my own career. And then, of course, after diving into this for a little bit, I also discovered how crazy this whole universe is, how many people have done self-experiments on themselves, and how many exciting pieces of progress that's been in the last couple of years. So it kind of fits perfect in a book as well.
So I have a couple of questions about general overarching concepts that I'd like to go into. But before I ask you about, for example, hormesis, is there something that is there an umbrella statement that you want to make about aging, or about the things that contribute to aging? I don't want to jump ahead to a topic that's like a subtopic.
No, I would just say that what I probably find most surprising from all this work on the aging process is how variable it is. Because, going into all of this, and, naively, you might think that it's some kind of physical law that just affects every single biological organism. First of all, we know now that's not true. So there are animals that don't age, and as the book title also reveals, there are even animals that can age backwards. Then also, if you look at different animals, you can also see even the ones that do age, they do so at completely different speeds. So for instance, an old mouse has some of the same kinds of degeneration as an old human has, but it just happens in 2 to 3 years, whereas in a human it happens maybe in 80 or 90 years. And in, say, a Greenland shark, it might not happen until they're 400 years old. So this whole variability in how different aging can be, that is, first of all, just from a scientific standpoint, incredibly exciting, but also, like, from an applied standpoint, it's kind of promising, because it just seems to suggest that it's not inevitable, at least in the way that we humans age right now. That's not the only way things could be. So it seems there's a lot we could have a lot of progress if we apply ourselves.
Absolutely. And there's so many different, not anecdotes, but case studies of animals that you go into in the book. But let's talk for a minute. Tell us about the titular jellyfish, if you will, because it's such an interesting
Yes.
case.
So as I said, the animals, that age slower and faster than us, and some animals like lobsters, for instance, that don't age. But then we also have this jellyfish called Turritopsis. So it's not every jellyfish; it's a specific subspecies, a specific species of jellyfish called Turritopsis that's kind of the size of a fingernail. So if we just had one right here, it's not the most exciting thing to look at. It's just a jellyfish that swims around and eats plankton, and that's basically what is to it. But then if you know exactly how to treat this jellyfish, so if you stress it in just the right way, that's when it reveals this incredible trick it has. So for instance, you can starve it, you can expose it to high temperatures, and then you can go from its adult stage back to something called the polyp stage. That would be kind of akin to a butterfly turning into a caterpillar again, or maybe to you and I turning into a kindergartner again. And then from this stage, the jellyfish can grow up anew. Then you can stress it once more, and it will rejuvenate itself. Then it grows up anew, and you can actually just get it to go around and around in these, you would call it rejuvenation cycles. So of course, when you're a tiny jellyfish in a big ocean, you're not going to live forever. You're going to get eaten by something. But at least in theory and in the lab, no one has found a specific limit to how often we could potentially make the jellyfish do this rejuvenation trick. So in theory, it could be, basically the holy grail of aging research, and that's an animal that's biologically immortal.
Wow, that is super interesting. I mean, like you say, that's not going to protect a jellyfish from being, swallowed by something, but you're saying that there is no limit that we know of to the amount of times this cycle could happen.
Exactly.
How interesting. And you mentioned also that in passing, that there are animals and entities that don't age. And you mentioned the lobster. The lobster doesn't age?
Yeah, so of course we'll have to define aging to understand why. But the main way we could define it, for instance, for humans, is that we peak relatively early in life, and then from there, we have this decline in most of our physical functions. So we get weaker, we get less fertile, we have a higher risk of disease because stuff like our immune system gets worse. And basically, just you can imagine every organ system just becoming worse at the job that it's intended to do. So that means that the strongest and healthiest human is someone who's pretty young, maybe in the early or mid-20s. But for lobsters, this just doesn't happen. So with time, a lobster grows ever stronger, ever bigger. It gets more and more fertile, so that the very most like fit lobsters, you might say, is the oldest ones. Now, that doesn't mean lobsters then live forever for that reason. Actually, they can get so big in the end that they get these physical problems when they do a shed, and they actually can die from exhaustion when they do that.
Wow.
But the point is just that aging for a lobster is nowhere like it is for a human. It's basically just all of your life. Imagine just getting stronger and just better at everything. And that means if you want to find the strongest lobster, you go to look at the oldest one, basically.
Which would also be the biggest one. So
Yes.
right. And then they encounter, but the problems that they encounter are not problems of aging, it's problems of size or problems of scale.
Yes, it's these physical problems where at the end they've grown so big that they're not really built to handle that. And we don't see that as often anymore because, lobsters are harvested a lot more. But for instance, when people came to America for the first time, or when Europeans arrived and it wasn't overfished yet, there was just a lot of very, very large lobsters compared to today.
Wow, that is really interesting. Really interesting. And then there were, of course, you talk about some examples from the plant world too. Is there anything that you want to call out from that space?
Yeah, I mean, in my book, I to make the convincing case that aging is malleable, I of course start with the animals that are kind of close to us. I mean, we could even go even closer than animals and talk about all these long-lived people and how some people will live decades more than the rest of us. But then as I move out, there's interesting cases in different degrees of biological separation from us, and one of them is definitely if we go to the plant world, because some of the complex organisms that live the longest are different kinds of plants, in particular different kinds of trees. So there are different trees alive today that are more than 5,000 years old. Among them, an American tree called Methuselah, which is believed to be older than the pyramids. There's even this giant root system called Pando in Utah, which is believed to be at least these 7,000-8,000 years old, and might even originate all the way back 14,000 years ago or 12,000 years ago. So there's just these extremely long-lived trees, but of course it's a little harder to transfer that ability then from a tree to a human. There's a lot of stuff that differs, but it just goes to show again that you can have a complex animal that can kind of stand the test of time for a very, very long time.
Yes, definitely. So the book, I'm going to just show, this is the UK version. Do you want to hold up the US version just for a sec?
We have the US version.
And the UK, yeah.
So the Danish version, if you
yeah, and the Danish version, the original.
Yeah.
So the book, all of them, the Danish, the UK, and the US, are divided into three sections: Nature's Wonders, which we've talked a little bit about here, Scientists' Discoveries, and Good Advice. And I think you hinted at what is needed, what we do to the jellyfish to get it, that particular jellyfish, to get it into this regenerative cycle. And it's that's, we stress it. And stress as a concept, the concept of hormesis, is one that is like pervasive throughout the book. So I wonder if you could introduce us to that concept and ways we might integrate it into our own lives.
Yes. So throughout the book, I try to get ever more concrete. So we start at here's what nature shows us could be possible. Then we go to here is what the scientists are working at the moment. And then in the end, we're like, okay, we don't have all this amazing stuff yet. What am I going to do right now if I want to increase my chances of maybe seeing this stuff come to fruition at one point? And one of the themes that keeps popping up when you talk about stuff that we can do to ourselves if we want to live longer is this concept of hormesis. And that is basically strength through adversity. So one of the key ways that biological organisms differ from stuff like, a mechanical object like a car or watch or something is that if you have a car, it kind of ages every time you use it. So every little piece of damage will, of course, never go away, and it will just take the car one step further towards being non-functional. But if you have a human, that's just not the case, because we have the amazing ability as biological organisms to renew and repair ourselves. So it actually turned out that if you want to live a long life, you don't necessarily want to protect yourself at all costs. You do actually want to challenge your body a little bit. And the easiest way to understand this in a concrete way is to think about exercise, because we know that one of the best things you can do for a long life is to be physically active and do a lot of exercise. We can see that all the way up from the couch potatoes all the way to the fittest of the fit, you see a benefit. So in each little step of the fitness ladder you get, you have a decreased risk of dying early. But if we think about what actually happens while you're out exercising, many people think that's where the healthy stuff occurs. But when you're out for a run, your blood pressure is high, your pulse is high. There's, of course, a stressor, not beneficial if you look at it in isolation. Your muscles are damaged, your bones are damaged from carrying all your weight. Your lungs are challenged by providing you with enough oxygen. So in the short run, you're actually damaging yourself. That's why it hurts. That's why your brain tries to tell you, stop doing this stuff. But then the magic starts to occur when you're done exercising, because all of this damage is then left, and the body sees the damage as a kind of signal. So this damage is a signal that turns on different processes in the body that are involved in repair, first of all, and are then involved in different kinds of strengthening. So that means as soon as you're done damaging yourself, your body swoops in, removes the damaged molecules, strengthens the different organs that needs to be strengthened. So next time you go for a run, you have stronger muscles, stronger bones, a stronger heart, better lungs, and so on and so on. So that's like the easiest way to understand hormesis. But then in my book, I also, get into a lot of maybe a little less straightforward ways that you can use this concept on yourself.
But let's look at some of those, because exercise is one that I think most people know about, but there are several other kind of areas in which the same principle applies. Should we talk about them?
Yes, absolutely. So for instance, if we restrict ourselves to laboratory animals, they have been shown to have benefits from all kinds of crazy stuff. So for instance, I mentioned a study in my book where they took these laboratory worms and then they exposed them to all kinds of basically poisons. For instance, different kinds of weed killer. And it turns out that if you give a high dose of weed killer to these worms, of course, the obvious thing happens and then they die from poisoning. But if you give a low dose of this weed killer, it actually turns out the worms end up living longer than the worms that weren't exposed at all. In the same way, there's these studies where they take mice and expose them to radioactive radiation. And if you do that, these mice actually, of course, in a high dose die early, but on a low dose live longer than the mice that weren't exposed. So that's like an example. Same goes for exercise, of course, that there is like a dose where you stress your system too much to recover from, but at an appropriate dose, you can actually prolong the life of laboratory organisms in these weird ways. And then, of course, I also have to point out that that's not, I'm not recommending anyone to go home and experiment with weed killer or radiation. The point is just that this is not just something that, comes from clean stressors like exercise. It seems to be this fundamental concept in biology where for some reason we sometimes need, a little kick to get these processes of repair started. So a more gentle way to do that besides exercise could be something like using the sauna. So we have good evidence from laboratory animals that if you take these laboratory worms, for instance, and you expose them to short periods of very high heat, so what you would call heat stress, that actually also prolongs their life compared to having these worms that are never exposed to heat. And then we know from our lovely Nordic neighbors in Finland, where they really, really love to use the sauna, that something similar seems to happen in people that use the sauna a lot. So that's our version of heat stress. And these frequent sauna users, they tend to have a lower risk of getting cardiovascular diseases, so stuff like getting a heart attack. They have a lower risk of getting dementia, and they also have a lower risk of dying early. So it seems that in these people, sauna use can actually be protective as well. And if you dive into like the molecular mechanisms of all this, it seems to be some of the same processes as exercise that actually involved. That doesn't mean that, you know, you could take, you know, just quit your daily run or your weekly run and then go to the sauna instead. Of course not. But it does suggest that, you know, exposing yourself to a few of these stressors could make you more resilient in like broad terms. So also against other stressors you haven't encountered yet.
I'm going to anticipate a question from the audience because there's a big cold water swimming community here. So I'm going to ask you, does the same hold true for cold?
Yeah, so my colleague, Susanna Søberg, who also has actually a book out and who's a colleague, was a colleague of mine at the University of Copenhagen, she actually published this big study where they studied winter swimmers and really studied their physiology in depth. And what you can say from these studies is that it seems to have a very beneficial effect on stuff like the immune system, so fewer sick days, better metabolic markers. It seems to also have like a mood boosting effect. So there's actually trials running right now where they take people with depression and then of course give them antidepressants, but then see if, you know, winter swimming can boost the effect beyond what you could get from just the medication. So there's a lot of these signs that it's beneficial, but for longevity, we don't have the same amount of data yet because it hasn't been studied to the same depth. There is some laboratory animal studies that seem to suggest that if you only could pick one, heat would be a little better. But that doesn't mean that cold is worse. It's just that heat seems to be very beneficial. So if I only had to pick one, I would actually pick the sauna. But you know, here and in a lot of the other places around the Nordics, it's very popular to do this contrast therapy with the sauna and winter swimming sauna and winter swimming for a few times. And I definitely wouldn't stop doing that.
Yeah. It's also very pleasant. So.
Absolutely, it's pleasant after a little while.
Yeah. Right, absolutely. I jumped right into Hormesis, but you had mentioned that there's all sort of information in the book about important and fascinating scientific discoveries that are happening right now, and I definitely don't want to jump over that because that's a critical part of the book and really fascinating. Do you want to touch on some of those that you think are most meaningful or interesting?
Yeah, so the ones that are most meaningful. Well, there is a lot. There's a lot of stuff happening right now. For one, this whole concept with the rejuvenating jellyfish. There's actually people trying kind of similar mechanisms in human cells to see can that somehow rejuvenate human cells as well. There's some promising results also in mice of people trying this. So that would be one thing. It's what's called a cellular reprogramming. Then there's a lot of study also into a specific drug called rapamycin that is involved in cellular growth signaling that, at least in laboratory animals, can prolong life quite substantially. So we also have this research into like more classic pharmacological solutions, these small molecules that you can take and that block some kind of enzyme or protein and then hopefully prolongs life. Then we have a lot of research into what I call zombie cells in the book, these cells that get this weird, they go through this weird transition where they kind of end up hovering between life and death. And in the process, they spew out a lot of inflammatory molecules that not only spread this condition to other cells, but that also harms healthy tissue and seems to accelerate aging. At least if you remove them in mice, then the mice live longer. So there's a lot of these different fields. Aging research is such a big thing now that there's not just like one thing called aging research. There's all these different avenues that people have chosen and gone down through, and then people, of course, trying to find out which is the most fruitful one to pursue.
Right, absolutely. There's a concept of, I'll just go to the chat really quickly to go back to our heat discussion where one of our folks here asks, does a hot tub have the same beneficial effect from heat as a sauna, say?
I don't know if there's been studies on it, but in theory, the problem is that you couldn't go in a hot tub that's as hot as a sauna. On the other hand, water transfers heat better than air. So it is really about what you could expose yourself to. I would say, the studies are on sauna use, so to be absolutely sure, I would use that. But if you have a hot tub in the backyard, why not? Definitely wouldn't harm.
Right, exactly. I was going to ask you about autophagy, but I think it might be better because autophagy is, because of what it is to talk maybe more about the topic that you raised in chapter 18 and the called Starving for Fun. Would you tell us a little bit about that study, and then maybe we can go into some sort of dietary stuff.
Yes. So the most reliable way to prolong the life of laboratory animals is something called calorie restriction. And it's not exactly pleasant. It's basically where you take laboratory animals, then you make sure they get all the nutrients they need, so they don't get deficiencies or anything, but you cut down the amount of calories they eat. And if you do that to a mouse, in most strains of mice, basically, if you cut down calories a little, they live a little longer. You cut down calories even more, they live even longer, and so on. And actually, in some of these studies, the longest lived mice are the ones that are basically on the edge of starvation. So that's a very well reproducible way to prolong the life of mice, but it's of course not the most pleasant thing if we had to adopt it. But there is a society in the US actually called the Calorie Restriction Society, where people actually do this and have done it for a long time. And if you look into different biomarkers, they have perfect immune systems, great blood pressures, great cholesterol levels. It's just in general really, really healthy. But I think a lot of them will also admit that maybe they feel a little cold, a little tired throughout the day. So it's not exactly the best thing to, even if you could prolong your life maybe a few years by doing this stuff, would you then do it? And probably no. So instead, scientists have said, okay, at least this is the way to prolong life that is pretty robust. Maybe we can find a drug that can kind of trick the body into thinking that it's starving. Because as you mentioned, autophagy, this concept that means self-eating, is at least something we think is involved in this process. And it's basically, you can imagine the body starts to reuse a lot of the different components of itself. So break down old proteins and reuse the amino acids to build new proteins, get rid of different kinds of cellular waste, use a building block to build new molecules. So we know that is induced by calorie restriction, but could you then induce it by something else? It could be a drug like this, the stop rapamycin that I talked about before. Turns out it could maybe also be another health practice, because it seems you can get some of the same effects by fasting. So that is in principle being calorie restricted for a little while, but in at least in animal studies, so in mice, if you make mice fast but make them eat enough calories overall, they actually live almost as long as these mice that are calorie restricted all the time. So it might just be that the simple act of being calorie restricted sometimes is enough to get these benefits. And of course, fasting is way more palatable for us to do. It's something that is even a trend in for different other reasons, for weight loss. Some people use it doing their training for different kinds of sports. So that's something I then dive into in the book. Is fasting then something we should do now that calorie restriction is probably off the table?
So we have one question here. Would it be safe to say that trying to avoid the effects of aging, the stress levels you wish to follow would fall into the Yerkes-Dodson law? I don't know the Yerkes-Dodson law, so I will defer.
I'm not exactly familiar with that name. Maybe if the person can describe in more detail, we can answer.
Yeah, we can come back to that. But going back to the idea of both fasting and sort of dietary recommendations, I mean, fasting is, I mean, it's so trendy and so popular around the world right now. But I was thinking of this anecdote, just to jump out of this, the more scientific stuff, and back to this anecdote that you had about in Venice with Luigi Cornaro. Can you tell us a little bit about his dietary recommendations, which were not exactly fasting?
It's a story about this this Venetian nobleman, and he was born in the mainland under kind of modest, I think in modest conditions. I think his dad was an innkeeper or something like that. But then he was an engineer, and he came up with ways to drain land, which is kind of profitable if you happen to be around Venice, where there's a lot of swamps and stuff. So he became very wealthy and started living this life of lots of drink and lots of food. And he started gaining a lot of weight. And in his 40s, he felt like tired, sluggish, basically old already. And then he started to think, is there anything I can do about this? And he thought that the only way to get back to like his former glory would be to start to restrict all of this excess he had started to indulge in. So he basically came up with this diet where he started excluding different foods and only eating a certain amount of food. And actually, first of all, it worked. So he started dropping his weight back to his normal level, and he started feeling energetic again. And then throughout his life, he actually kept experimenting with this stuff and publishing different books about his newfound method for longevity or health. And in the end of his life, he was down to just eating a single egg for each meal, something like that, according to the story, of course. You know, it's of course a complete anecdote, but he lived for something between 98 and 102 years. So that's a really, really long time for someone.
Especially in that era.
Exactly, especially in that era. So basically 2 whole lives for someone that lived in that time. So it's kind of the first example we have of someone experimenting on their own body and then getting to this realization that it would help them to at least restrict calories somewhat, and then reaping the benefits.
And writing a book about it, which is now a cottage
and
industry
writing a book
for people.
I think one of them was called something like How to Live a Long Life, and he kept publishing all the way into his 90s, and had his books circulating all around Europe. And it's a pretty fun story, and actually also something maybe you wouldn't expect for someone who lived more than 400 years ago.
Right. I mean, if you look around today, how many books are there in the market about how to live a long life and how to do this X or Y, or dietary recommendations such as his? I was an egg for every meal doesn't sound so. It was better. I thought it sounded more attractive when he was including the wine earlier on, and like.
Yes. So he was Italian, so his special diet included lots and lots of wine still. Also, probably that was safer to drink back then than trying to drink the water. So it was a good move if we wanted to live a long life back then. Right.
But coming back into today and the science and sort of thinking about the fasting element of it, are there and then tying that to autophagy too? There's a certain level of fasting at which you get autophagy, right? And I think most people today who are doing kinds of fasting or calorie restriction are following kinds of patterns. So there'll be intermittent fasting. What do you think about those different patterns?
Yeah, so the big problem here is that we still don't have a lot of data on. I mean, as always, when you want to prove something in humans, we could set up a study and then wait 20, 30 years until some people start dying, and then we can tally up, oh, well, did it then prolong your life? But that's expensive, takes so long, and, if there's just a slight mistake in the study, we might not learn so much. So the whole question on what would be the optimal way of fasting is really, really not answered at this point. You could say if you transfer directly from mice, well, if you make a mouse fast for a whole day, that's equivalent to a human fasting for a lot longer than one day. So if you wanted to transfer that to humans, then you would need, these several days of fasting. But then on the other hand, For most people who live a normal life and have a normal job, I mean, are you gonna take 4 days out of your week to just not eat and then be tired and sluggish at work, or spend your vacation fasting or something? That's just not very realistic. It's not something that I would even recommend, especially given that we don't have all of the evidence in at this point. So I think the only way that is realistic is, either you go really hard and do this stuff a few times a year, or you can do a few times of what's called time restricted eating, where you basically cut a meal. Most people do breakfast, but actually studies show that if you cut a meal, it's way better to cut dinner than it is to cut breakfast. So in general, to load your calories earlier in the day as compared to later. So that is what I do myself sometimes. But besides that, it's still a really murky area where, it also depends on your goal. For weight loss, it's an entirely different thing. A lot of people that are doing this 5-2 diet, where you have 2 days a week where you don't really eat, and that can be easier for people sometimes than having to, sit down every time and, not be allowed to eat this and not be allowed to eat that. Then just simply say, I'm gonna just skip some meals and then I'm just gonna eat whatever I want in the rest of the time.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Is there what is the biological reason that breakfast is more important to have, or that skipping dinner is more effective?
Well, we don't know for sure, but the thing is, there's lots of our biology that's following these called circadian rhythms. So of course we are evolved to see the sun rise and fall, and there's a lot of our bodies that are kind of set to this internal clock that we have. If we become more like low practical about it, at least for me, I track the quality of my sleep most nights, and I can just see if I eat within 3 hours approximately of going to bed, my sleep will just be worse. So I just sleep worse for whatever reason, maybe because digestion kind of disturbs my sleep. So in general, that's one way, but we don't know for sure why this is.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. So there's a question that's germane to this topic, which is, we live in an age of food supplements. The stores are full of them, as the book also talks about a placebo effect. I wonder how much of a placebo is actually involved in the food supplement market. I think talking about placebos is a really rich topic.
Yes. So there is a lot of placebo involved. And the problem of supplements is that it's kind of like the Wild West. There's not that much regulation always. So you can, there is oversight. So it is not like you're going to poison yourself and die in most cases, but it's very possible to actually start taking a supplements that will make stuff worse rather than better. So, it's kind of ironic trying to live longer and buying all these expensive supplements and then actually decreasing your chances. For instance, in the book, I talk a lot about antioxidant supplements, which was a big rage a few decades ago and has, actually been ever since. But, studies that follow people that take antioxidant supplements actually suggest that they have a slightly increased risk of getting cancer, of the cancer spreading, of dying an early death. So it seems kind of ironic to spend a lot of effort if you're going to decrease your chances at the end. So in that way, for myself, I tend to be kind of conservative about this. Of course, there are some supplements I recommend in the book, but you really don't want to just rush out and take whatever the latest guru recommends you, because even though some people think it's boring, if you want to start doing like optimizing your health, you have to start with your diet, your exercise, your sleep, your social life, and then once you have a firm like fundamentals, then you start building with the small things like supplements on top.
I'm going to encourage people to put more questions into there because we're going to save some time just for questions at the end. But one thing that I didn't know much about in your book before I started translating it was the idea of telomeres. And that was a fascinating case that you talk about in here. Can you tell us what telomeres are and what they signal and how we work with them?
Yes. So inside each of our cells, we have our DNA contained in these structures called chromosomes. And chromosomes, which are these, as I said, these long structures, they actually have the same problem as something like a shoelace has, namely that, the end has a disproportionate risk of getting damaged or fraying somehow. So you can imagine that if we have our different genes in the DNA or in the chromosome, then at the genes at the end have this disproportionate risk of getting damaged somehow. So we have these long structures that sit at the end, which also consist of DNA, but are just these repetitive segments again and again and again. So that if something gets damaged, it's just these repetitive segments and no information is really lost. Then every time our cells divide, these structures get a little shorter. So you can kind of see it as a little biological watch where the telomeres just get shorter and shorter through cell division in most cells. And actually, once they get very short, the cell enters what's called senescence, and that is basically the equivalent of cellular aging. So you could say now you have an aged cell, an old cell, and it will usually end up undergoing what's called apoptosis. So it's basically cellular suicide, where it ends up dying in some way. But then some people thought, wait, what about if we could then, continuously elongate these telomeres? Would we then live longer? So you can use an enzyme called telomerase to elongate the telomeres. If you do that in mice, they live longer than mice where you don't do it. So that is one of the things that gets researched. The problem with this approach is we actually have this enzyme telomerase. We use it when we are still very, very early in our life, when we have a lot of cell divisions because we grow a lot, to maintain our telomeres. And the reason we don't keep doing that, even though it can actually fight some aspects of aging, is that it also increases the risk of cancer. So cancer is basically immortal cells that can divide like crazy. And one of the reasons is that they go to that they gain access to this telomerase enzyme again and can keep elongating their telomeres every time they divide. If they couldn't do that, then they wouldn't be able to keep growing. So unfortunately, this is a thing where you can see it in cells. You can, you at least push them towards immortality, but that's just not always a good thing on an organismal level because it increases the risk of cancer. So we can also see people who have genetically determined longer telomeres, they tend to have a lower risk of stuff like Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, but also an increased risk of certain cancers. So in the end, it kind of cancels out, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. There's a question, is there a psychological law that focuses on finding the optimal level of stress in your life?
There's not a psychological law, I would say. But there's definitely an aspect to this stuff as well with mental health, where we can see people who, of course, have too much to do develop chronic stress disorders, which is, of course, not a very good thing if you want to live a long life. But we also know of people who have, everything, no real challenges in their life. And it tends to make people kind of feel meaningless and some people get depressed. So it seems that humans are organisms that are evolved to face problems and solve problems, and we do best when we have some problems at our hands that we can work on, some challenges in our life. So I would definitely extend this concept to mental health as well, for sure.
A lot of times when people are looking to apply either hormetic stress, or they're looking for the minimally effective dose of those things, like what is the least amount that you have to do to get some benefit from it. So there's another question we have here is, your research looks at fasting, exercise, or supplements. Are there other epigenetic factors that you believe are going to make great strides in biological research?
Epigenetics is another area actually that is pretty big in aging research right now. It's also a little controversial area because people don't agree what role epigenetics have in the aging process. Definitely, if you believe this strategy that's followed by people that kind of emulate the jellyfish, epigenetics plays a huge role. And to people that don't know what epigenetics is, it basically means on top of genetics, So you can imagine that all your cells have all your DNA, but of course they don't need all of your DNA. So a cell that's a muscle cell, it doesn't need stuff like taste receptors, or it doesn't need to produce proteins for the skin or something like that. The cell also has this kind of control system on top of genetics, where it can like put kind of little markers on the gene saying, turn this gene off, turn this one on, turn this on occasionally, shut this down completely, and so on and so on. And we can see the pattern of these markers. They tend to change also with aging. And it makes sense. First of all, when you grow up, of course, your cells will get different roles. The best examples is in puberty, where suddenly, your body changes in a lot of ways. And that's, of course, because the cells also start to change how they use your genes. But it's actually turned out that this, you would call a program, tends to continue even once you're done growing, and you would think that we are like fully grown. There's still these changes, epigenetic changes, that seem to follow this pattern that you can measure and then use to pretty accurately estimate how old a person is. And we don't know if that's because the epigenetics are causing the aging process, or if they're just following along the aging process. So we don't really know what to do about this stuff at this point, but it does seem that there is some kind of connection between aging and epigenetics for sure.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to encourage people, we're at the 10-minute mark, so I'm going to encourage people who have questions to get them in now. I mean, I have lots of questions for Nicklas, but I want to make sure we get to everyone's questions. So what were some of the biggest surprises that you found doing this research?
Definitely, as I said, how malleable aging is. So at this point, for instance, I know we talked about animals, but even if we look at people, there's of course a huge variability in how long we live. So some people will get an age-related disease at 60, or maybe even at 50, die from a heart attack, for instance, get some kind of cancer. Then other people will break, the 100-year mark and live into maybe the 110s or something crazy like that. Basically, what you can see if you study centenarians is that they tend to die of the exact same things as the rest of us do. It just happens maybe 20, 30, 40 years later than it does to other people. And that seems to suggest that these people simply just age more slowly. So at any given point, for instance, now we talked about this epigenetics that can kind of measure how old you are. If you do that to some of these people that are maybe like 105, 110, they look younger than that on this test. So it seems that, chronologically, it's very true that they are 105, 110 years old, but biologically speaking, they're just not, their clock is just ticking more slowly than for the rest of us. And that's actually hugely encouraging, because that just seems, if it's possible for this person, but not for this person, well, the biological differences between people is not that great. So if we can just understand maybe what's the genetic underpinnings of this, or what's the lifestyle factors that are underpinning this, then it should be possible to transfer the ability from centenarians to the rest of us, so that we could all have the slowest possible aging for a human body.
Right, and you look into the so-called blue zones where people do live the longest, and do you want to talk a little bit about what those people do?
Yeah, so the blue zones is a very, very tricky subject, because the main story is just that the demographers have gone into the world trying to find different areas where you have a vastly increased chance of living more than 100 years. So becoming a centenarian. Then they had a blue pin, and they marked the area. That's why we call it a blue zone. So in the beginning, this story was all good. You can go and study these people. You found out that they eat a lot of beans, for instance. They tend to have close social relationships. A lot of stuff that would make sense from what we otherwise know about health. The problem that has come recently is that the demographers that did this research have, of course, verified everything very thoroughly, but it's just in some of these areas, it is hard to verify the ages of people. It tends to be these rural areas, kind of underdeveloped areas, where record keeping might not be optimal. So just as an example, for instance, a country like Japan, it's actually a very well organized country, and a country that's known for living a long time. But approximately 10 years ago, they did this survey where they tried to reach out to all the centenarians they had in their registers. And it turned out that more than 200,000 of them were unaccounted for. For instance, when they tried to reach the oldest man in Tokyo to give him like an award for being the oldest man in Tokyo, he turned out to just be a skeleton in his apartment, and he's been dead for 30 years. And that's because in some areas, you know, if your granddad dies, you don't report it to the authorities, because then you can keep getting the social security from the government. And you know, nothing has been proven about any different area, but it's just you just have to wonder about some of these areas if something like that could be in play. Because it tends to be, you know, if you look at the blue zone in Italy, in Sardinia, it's in one of the poorest areas of Italy, with the most alcoholism, the most crime, lowest levels of education, and so on. So it would seem an odd place for very long-lived people. Then again, if you look at the habits of these people, there's no doubt that they do live very healthily. Like, they have low BMIs, they get a lot of exercise, they have very healthy social connections as well. But at this point, I've become more and more skeptical when I read stories about, oh, this person lived this long, or this country is the longest lived, because record keeping for longevity is surprisingly hard.
It's always good to be a little skeptical about these things. So we have another question. What is the relationship in longevity and disease between genetic factors versus environmental factors, lifestyle, etc.?
That's a very good question, because naively you might expect, well, isn't it all genetic anyways? You know, if your parents lived a long time, you are going to do that too. And if not, then you're going to die early. But the best studies we have of this actually seems to suggest the opposite. So the more data you include, the less genetic longevity seems to be. So there's been these huge studies where people have looked at pedigrees, a lot of them which are online now, so you can go through like millions of pedigrees at once and see what is the correlation between family members in longevity. And it's really surprisingly low. For instance, there's a higher correlation between a person and their spouse than there is between that person and their opposite sex siblings. And now, you know, you share at least half of your genes with your siblings. And I mean, I hope you don't share any of your genetics with your spouse. But what you do share with your spouse is that for a long part of your life, you're going to share your environment with them. So it just seems to suggest that environment really trumps genetics when it comes to how long you live. So if you want to affect this area, it's really something that's in your own hands. And of course, we have found different genetic mechanisms that seem to increase your chance of living a long life. But the overall picture is just that, you know, it's very environmental in origin, actually.
I am so encouraged to hear you talk about how malleable it is. Maybe as a person in midlife, that's not surprising. But we've got a couple of minutes left, and I would love, if you are comfortable, to get a peek into what you're writing about, what you're researching now.
Well, actually, just first, when you say at midlife, one of the other surprising and kind of promising things that's come out of aging research is a lot of the times when you take a laboratory organism, especially a mouse, right, and you have these different drugs that have been proven to work in mice. So we haven't tried them in humans yet, but we know that if you give this drug to a mouse, maybe it lives like 15% longer, 20% longer, 25% longer, something like that. A lot of the times then, if you take the drug and only start it at midlife, or maybe even in old age, it actually gets almost the same life extension as if you start all the way when the animal is young. So that seems to suggest that, at least in mice and hopefully also in people, that a lot of the aging process, you can actually start fighting it rather late in your life and then get a good effect. So that's just another thing that I think at this point the most important role in this field is also just, you know, to underline how possible this actually is if we put the resources in here.
And so before I circle back again and ask you about your forward-looking research, so say you're someone in midlife, what changes or adaptations would you recommend of the things that we've discussed today and the things in your book to make the biggest change? Yeah,
I've really tried to make the book like a buffet of advice so that you can pick and choose what fits for you. Of course, I think there are some things that are like the fundamentals that you really can't go without. So all the classics like not smoking and having a normal body weight, and especially exercising, stuff like keeping or doing a lot of aerobic training to strengthen your heart and your cardiovascular system. That's like the fundamentals. But then, there are a ton. You can start trying the sauna. I talk about blood donation. I talk about this weird advice on using dental floss, different supplements, whether you should use fish oil or whether you should stop some supplements, for instance, stuff like vitamin D. And I have this kind of buffet with the stuff that I've been able to find. And then I think, if you're like me, I just like to try a lot of this stuff and then, of course, measure how it works. That is the most promising approach.
I like to do that too. And I did, as I was working on your book, I started implementing all these different things that you would see, that you had recommended, and seeing what differences it made in my life. And it was, it was very fun. And so let's talk about your next book. We've only got a couple minutes, and you had mentioned this is going to be a trilogy. So let's, if you're comfortable with it, talk about it.
Yes. So it's still a secret, actually, what the next book is going to be about. But what I can say is that it's not about aging research, but it fits perfectly where Jellyfish Age Backwards leaves off. So it's like the perfect thing that continues right after that. And it comes out in Danish in September. So I'm actually writing it right now. I've been writing on it today. And of course, then when it comes out, we are going to start, hopefully, before that, of course, approaching all our partners that we now have internationally, and a lot of them have already shown interest. So we're, of course, hoping that this is going to be another 26 language book. That would be, of course, a dream.
At least. So which, we have 2 minutes left before 11. We can go a couple minutes over, I think. So which countries has Jellyfish had the most traction in, and why do you think that is?
Well, we had a really nice reception here in the US. So I've been on TV and got a lot of nice reviews in big newspapers and stuff. Then besides that, I would say Spain has been amazing. Like, been in all the national newspapers down there. Tons of interest on my social media from Spaniards and Spanish people. Also in Mexico. So I was on Mexican TV as well, which was kind of fun. And we will have a special Mexican version, just like we have the English version for the US, and we have the British English version as well. There's also going to be a specific version just for Mexico. Besides that, Sweden, I have to mention. So our neighbors in Sweden, that has been very.
It was huge in Sweden.
The what?
It was. I know it was really, really huge in Sweden.
Absolutely, and I was very, very happy about that. Of course, maybe some people would say you could have guessed because it's very similar, but you never know. Sometimes Swedes like different stuff from Danes, but in this instance, we had such a nice reception from Sweden. Then other countries, also a few Eastern European ones like Romania has had a very good reception. Estonia as well. I remember a lot of people from Estonia contacting me about the book. So there's been all this, and I've had interest from all the languages. But of course, some places like these have been extra nice.
Well, I'm sure that you will have an equal amount of interest from the next book and for the third book when that ultimately comes out. So I think we'll wrap it up here. Jill, did you want to make any closing comments?
Yes, I did. Thank you both for such a great conversation today. I want to extend the thank you also to our audience for engaging with us and sending in great questions. If you are itching for more of Jellyfish Age Backwards, the book is available in our museum store. Now there's a question about that in the Q&A function. So thank you all again for being here today. Special thanks to Elizabeth and Nicklas. And we look forward to seeing you at the National Nordic Museum very soon. Bye, everyone.